This committee has focused on a number of different things over the last year. One is exposing the malign activities of the CCP that I think we've done a good job in doing. The second thing is figuring out how do we win the strategic competition against China. And in my view, winning that on the economic front is key to the future on how we do that. Going back over 20 years ago when we allowed China into the World Trade Organization, that seems to be a pivotal moment in this country. The argument at the time, none of us, I think, were in Congress then, but the argument was bring China into the World Trade Organization. They're going to modernize, they're going to liberalize, their economy is going to become more like us. They're going to be part of the world global order. Clearly, that didn't work out the way that many of us thought it would. They play by a different set of rules, different set of standards. They're deceitful in many ways, steal intellectual property. And so here we are today having to deal with that. But we also have the reality that we have the two largest economic powers in the world. I think about my own district, probably similar to yours, Secretary Pompeo, corn and soybeans. 40% goes to China every year. My farmers need to rely on that market to do it. Take your Fortune 200 companies that are heavily invested in China. They're in bed in many ways with the CCP in terms of their business there. I have the largest concentration of Caterpillar workers anywhere in the world. CAT has 29 manufacturing plants in China, 4 R&D facilities there, and you can take any company and look at that. So when we think about how do we win the strategic competition against China, it's tough because it's our people in this country willing to take the economic hit that may be required. And many of us here in Congress want to go to a Cold War mentality with China on an economic front. And so we hear constantly from the BRT, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce companies that are in China saying, well, maybe you guys ought to hold off, pump the brakes, be careful about what you're doing. I'm curious, as we think about how we win the strategic competition economically, your advice on that.
I'll give you 2 thoughts. First, one, not fault those businesses for their activities there as a historic matter. We encouraged them to go there. This was, in fact, the model that you described from the accession to the World Trade Organization. Go there, be there, they'll become more like us. It just epically failed. It didn't work. It may have been reasonable at the time. What's that mean for Kansas farmers and for manufacturers across America who depend on it? It means 2 things. One, don't count on the fact that it will be a U.S. policy decision that drives them out of the country. We can see this already today. Executives being detained, products not being permitted to move. The Chinese Communist Party will have a say in the level of disconnection between our 2 economies, and I think Xi Jinping is intent upon making his country more self-reliant. So I would urge those leaders of those businesses to be thinking about alternative markets and how you de-risk your balance sheet from a presence in China today, and doing so immediately. The second piece is, and this is the policy role, we need to be clear about those things that are legal and illegal. It is difficult for business leaders when we tell them, oh, you ought not do that, but it is lawful. I promise you the Chinese Communist Party is telling them what is illegal inside of their country, and it is becoming more difficult, more punitive, and harder for them to operate in both of those environments. You, policymakers, have the responsibility to say, if you really want this disconnection, if you really want certain elements of supply chain moved, if you want them done, then we need to put a legal regime in place, and I promise you, the American economy will prosper, we will prevail. The Chinese Communist Party is far more dependent on America than we are on them, and we ought to use that to our advantage.
Thank you. Secretary Panetta.
Yeah, look, I agree with what Mike said. There are 2 important areas here. One is the competition in the economy, and there's nobody better at competition than the United States. Our farmers, our manufacturers, our businessmen, I mean, we know how to get it done. Innovation, creativity, that goes to the strength of our economy. So I think it is very important for the United States to be able to unleash that kind of creativity and capability. And too often we try to restrict it because of various rules, et cetera. We ought to be enhancing the freedom of our economy in order to allow people to compete and to develop the kind of products that sell in the world. Secondly, in dealing with China, I mean, look, I'm a believer in free trade, but I'm also a believer in fair trade. And the problem with China is, you know, we engage in trade, but they don't believe in fair trade in the way they operate. And what we have to do is we've got to be able to put, and you did it with your recommendations on the economy. I think they're great recommendations. You got 152 recommendations. They're all right on point. And one of those is making sure that we take the WTO and make certain that the WTO is strong enough to be able to say to China when it engages in unfair trade that that's what you're doing and you're going to be penalized for that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Torres.